Kenya is not a free country to determine its own destiny. As part of colonization, we inherited laws that we never bothered to change.
The early 1900s, we had two white British settlers coming to Kenya, acquiring about 10,000 hectares of land, displacing people, evicting people, and then the setting up of a multinational corporation at the time known as Kakuzi Fiber Limited. And because people have been pushed away from their land, they have been disenfranchised and impoverished by the situation of landlessness, they actually ended up providing cheap labor for this particular company.
Kakuzi came to Kenya and to this area around 1902. They took possession forcefully of all the land that belonged to the indigenous people. And to legitimize that daylight robbery of the land belonging to the indigenous people, they came up with English laws.
You've been able to dispossess a people and bring out their labor into the market. They're giving you their labor, but they're not getting fair value for their commodity on the market. We've commodified labor. When you adopt a legal system, you're using very old frameworks to try and recreate the nation state. You can't do that.
The world's legal systems derive very, very much from the colonial experience. As if there was no law before Britain arrived. There were laws. There were deeply ingrained laws and values. They may not have been written down, or they even may have been written down and dismissed. But the legal systems we have inherited deeply bear direct relations to the colonial experience. The result is greatly seen. I mean, land rights is the most obvious one.
It's all about the English law, which was alien to the indigenous people. But one important thing that we need to mention is also the role of post-colonial governments. In fact, most of the evictions took place after we attained independence. Kakuzi got a lot of support from the government to evict its own people.
In 1963, when the Mau Mau was able to push away the British and to regain independence for the country, we see that this land was given back to the locals. However, it was given back on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. So most of the land went to politicians and, of course, well-connected individuals who were able to acquire facilities, bank facilities, for example, bank loans to buy off the lands.
So this land ended up with Kakuzi, over 100,000 acres, Del Monte, and maybe other international companies, but which also have local shareholding.
Colonialism turned into neo-colonialism because in the process that led from the colonial status to the status of independence, in the negotiations, it was almost always agreed that the property relationships should remain as they were.
The way in which the post-colonial state came to power, in my view, it's like the privatization of a colony. So in the past you had a British ruler, but now they left behind a neatly packaged colony. They picked the people who are likely to be most loyal to them. They had played divide and rule anyway, so they already picked a powerful tribe, clan, etc. And they said, right, Keith, I'm giving this to you, my son. Today you will hand it. And by the way, I've built a supply chain that already means you have to give me a return. They inherit mass poverty, mass uneducation, and now they're supposed to create a new state out of this. So what they did quite literally is they moved physically into the same palaces and the same infrastructure that was left behind by the colonial power, and they relied on the same economic activity. So the process of extraction continued.
The company mainly produces avocado for export, and it's the largest avocado producing company in East Africa. Most of its avocados going to France. Quality products. Our mission is to respect the dignity and well-being of all those who work for us. This is laughable. We're talking about a company whose working conditions are extremely poor. We've seen the company being very deliberate to muzzle the voice of trade unions. We've seen women being raped by the security guards. That is the DNA of Kakuzi, that it is built on violations, it is built on sweat and blood, it is built on a very weak system of respecting rights. All this is Kakuzi land. Kakuzi actually occupies about 40,000 acres of land. This is Kinyangi. Most of the workers working in Kakuzi live here. The workers were very afraid. They're really scared about possible reprisals from the company.
Wakati mimi niliajiriwa, nilipata watu wanachapwa viboko. Na leading guards.
When I was employed in 1999, employees were being whipped by security lead guards in Kakuzi, in Witness State.
Ilikuwa kama manager akiona hao watu wameajiriwa, atakuja, atachagua ni mwanamke mgani amempendeza, anampeleka block tofauti. Na kwa sababu ule mwanamke naye anaogofia kuja kusema asipoteze kazi, anafanyiwa tu mambo huko na wengi walikuwa wasemi.
When shall we have our right? We want our voice to be heard.
Kuna ukoloni kwa sababu bado wanafanyia wafanyikazi vitu ambavyo havifai. Yaani wanjawahi tuachilia tukue huru kabisa.
Unfortunately, this is really a structural problem. We see the same with other multinational corporations. We have another company which is a pineapple producing company in Kenya called Del Monte, which is selling most of the pineapples to Europe. The history and the culture is the same. We had women crying on camera saying that I have lost my son to dogs, Del Monte dogs, that were released on little boys that were just playing in the fields of Del Monte. All these companies are actually multinational companies that have ownership from the West.
What we today have is no longer colonial companies, but transnational companies that have operations in a number of different states. Often those operations are one-sided in the sense that the extraction of value takes place in a former colonial territory and the profit is gained in the north. So the money flows from south to the north. As outrageous and surprising maybe it is, the world every year becomes slightly more unequal.
We have laws in Kenya, very progressive laws. For example, we have a very progressive constitution that was promulgated in 2010. For the first time, labor rights were actually anchored within the constitution. The right to associate, the right to join a trade union. However, we've had a challenge in the level in which our constitution has been enforced. You find that one labor officer serves an entire county. This labor officer is not facilitated, is not resourced, and so while they're supposed to undertake a labor inspection in Kakuzi, they're not able to do that. The power that is wielded by Kakuzi far outstrips the ability of the government to hold the company to account. So, of course, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights coming in 1948. However, the problematization of human rights really is a central question to engage with. A lot of this is coming from the North and passed down to the global South. There's a need to contextualize the understanding of human rights so that it is also reflective of the realities that are experienced by Africans. And it's important that where rights are violated, the question of accountability becomes very key.
Eurocentrism and unequal relations are an important part of the present global legal system. Of course, that global system looks different and operates differently from what it did during the time of formal colonialism. Now, the former colonial countries are independent. They send their representatives to the United Nations. They are listed among independent countries. But there is an immensely dense and extensive network of contractual and treaty relations that bind the colonial world into economic relations that are utterly unequal.
The African independence time leaders with the global South generally, they thought about how do we reimagine development? And they thought about let's try and establish a new post-colonial order that speaks to the reality that we have today. But then commodity prices came tumbling down and they are suddenly struggling to be able to finance their own nation states.
The new international economic order was really framed to try and get states to redress the balance that existed between the so-called haves, the OECD, and the rest of the world's populations. Despite the fact that the new international economic order has articulated very clear and obvious, it would seem, principles, realizing them is difficult because it means real change. If I say to you, we're going to redistribute something, somebody is going to have to give up what they have. If the person who has to give up what they have doesn't want to give up what they have, you're not going to get that kind of change. So the change is coming much more through resistance.
They broke it during the demonstration. This is Bird. He was the foremost leader for the Mau Mau, the movement that was fighting for Kenya's freedom, yes. He led very vibrantly in chasing out the white settlers.
It's more than 40 years now since independence, but we are still battling with most of the issues that our freedom fighters back then used to fight about. The cost of living has gone really high. Our food is expensive, like almost everything. Colonialism has contributed to the state of affairs. We are still grappling with land injustices, issues of accountability and just respect for the rule of law. That is among the demands of these protests that are likely to be happening now twice a week.
The present development order is just a logical and historical continuation of the previous civilization order. The South sees the only way of development to participate in the free trade arrangement that the West has created. And the West has created it in its own interests.
Our demand is basically that African countries will be able to make decisions for themselves.